It started subtly, almost innocently, in the way most neighborhood gossip often begins. A woman named Karen, charismatic, confident, and always present at community events, began to appear more frequently in HOA matters. She had been a longtime resident, known by many and seemingly well-liked. Her involvement in community cleanups, monthly garage sales, and even managing the community Facebook group made her a familiar face. But no one quite noticed when she began introducing herself as the new HOA president. It wasn't an official announcement. There was no election, no formal documentation, no newsletters detailing a leadership change. Instead, Karen relied on the power of casual authority, chatting with neighbors at the mailbox, speaking up at gatherings, and posting in the Facebook group with a new tone. As your new HOA president, she'd begin, followed by updates on landscaping, parking issues, or pet regulations. People assumed there had been a change. After all, she spoke with confidence and consistency, and no one immediately questioned her. The confusion was easy to exploit. The actual HOA president, Denise, had recently taken a temporary leave due to a family emergency out of state. She had been quiet, stepping away from her duties while dealing with a personal crisis. There was no formal notification sent to residents about her absence. Only a few board members knew the details. In that vacuum of leadership, Karen saw an opportunity. Karen began issuing directives. She drafted emails that looked official, complete with HOA logos and formatting that mirrored past communications. These messages addressed issues ranging from lawn maintenance violations to updates on neighborhood improvement projects. Some residents even received physical letters on printed letterhead, something the HOA hadn't done in months. The effort was convincing. Many believed that a proper transition of power had occurred. She took things further by attending committee meetings and subtly asserting herself as the authority figure. Whenever anyone raised a concern about procedural legitimacy, Karen deflected. It was all handled through internal channels, she'd say, or it's temporary while Denise is away. Most people didn't want to dig deeper. They just wanted the HOA to function and their community to stay organized. Karen's strong personality and natural command of conversation helped her reinforce the illusion. Soon, Karen was acting with full control. She told residents they were out of compliance for minor issues like leaving trash bins visible too long or not trimming hedges to regulation height. Some were fined, though there was no record of those fines within the actual HOA accounting. Others were warned via email, confused but unwilling to push back. Karen had created the impression that she was simply tightening enforcement, bringing structure where things had become lax. It helped that she looked the part. She wore business casual attire when walking around the neighborhood, often seen with a clipboard or tablet. She spoke in firm, administrative tones, referencing bylaws and citing HOA clauses that most residents had never actually read. People accepted her authority because she projected it so well. They didn't know they were being misled. A few residents started to get suspicious. Questions circulated quietly. Was there an election? Did Denise resign? Why haven't we seen any official notice from the board? But these questions were usually dismissed or redirected by Karen or her supporters, who praised her efficiency and blamed the confusion on bureaucratic delays. Karen even began forming new subcommittees, recruiting residents who were either unaware of the real situation or too flattered by the recognition to care. She gave titles, delegated tasks, and added names to unofficial rosters. It created a deeper illusion of structure. She leveraged this network to spread her message, making her leadership seem normal, even necessary. Her tactics weren't overtly aggressive. They were subtle, layered in charm, confidence, and familiarity. That was the key to her success. She didn't seize control overnight. She slipped into it, step by step, until it felt like she had always been in charge. No one saw it as a takeover, they saw it as continuity. And still, not a single formal announcement had ever been made. No vote, no transparency, no accountability. Just one woman gradually stepping into power, unchecked, unquestioned, and seemingly unstoppable. Once Karen had positioned herself as the presumed HOA president, she knew that perception alone wouldn't be enough to maintain control. She needed to solidify her influence through something more tangible, something that felt official, looked professional, and discouraged any doubts. That's when she turned to communication. It started with emails that mirrored the HOA's usual tone and style. She had clearly studied past correspondence, copying the structure, language, and even the formatting. The subject lines were matter-of-fact: notice of updated community guidelines, upcoming HOA fee schedule, reminder, lawn maintenance compliance. There was nothing flashy or suspicious, just routine notices designed to avoid raising alarms. The email address she used looked almost identical to the legitimate HOA one, with just a small variation, a single extra letter, a slight domain tweak, something most people wouldn't notice. But to a neighbor casually checking email while juggling daily life, it seemed authentic enough. The headers included the HOA name and a digital signature that looked legitimate. Attached were documents in PDF format, formatted with the HOA logo and legal style language. She even referenced sections of the HOA bylaws, some of which she had altered slightly to support whatever regulation she was pushing at the moment. Karen's control over communication didn't stop at digital platforms. She also began posting printed notices on community bulletin boards, especially near the clubhouse and mailbox areas where traffic was high. These notices announced upcoming policy reviews, new meeting dates, and decisions that were supposedly made by the board. Again, the materials were carefully designed to appear legitimate. She used the same font and logo style that the real HOA had used in previous newsletters. She even printed HOA board approved at the bottom of each notice, followed by a list of fabricated signatures, just initials, no full names, to avoid deeper scrutiny. She understood that repetition builds credibility. The more often people saw her name attached to these messages, the more they internalized her authority. When a rule is posted once, it's easy to ignore. When it's repeated across 3 platforms, email, bulletin boards, and Facebook posts, it starts to feel real. Karen began posting regular updates in the community Facebook group, announcing minor policy changes, offering reminders about pet leash laws, and giving clarifications about parking regulations. She engaged politely with commenters, answering questions with long-winded but confident responses that sounded like they came from someone deeply embedded in HOA operations. What gave her even more credibility was the way she referenced past events. As we discussed in last year's meeting, she would write, or, according to the March 2023 bylaw amendment. Most residents didn't have the time or energy to verify these claims, and since her posts were sprinkled with technical language and legal phrasing, they didn't feel the need to. She framed her statements with authority and used familiarity to create the illusion of continuity. No one stopped to ask who had voted for these changes or when they had been approved. Then came the fines. Karen began sending out notices to individual residents warning them of compliance violations, things like overgrown shrubs, improperly placed trash cans, or faded house numbers. These notices came in sealed envelopes left at front doors or tucked into mailboxes. The paper was thick, the layout formal, and the tone stern but not aggressive. Each letter had an arbitrary fine listed, usually between $25 and $75, and instructions on how to pay. She even provided a Venmo username and a P.O. box for mailed checks. Some residents paid without hesitation, believing they were simply being held to a stricter standard. She kept a spreadsheet of who paid and who didn't, using it to further manage her image. If someone questioned her authority, she'd casually mention that several residents have already paid their fines without issue, implying consensus. She pointed to those examples as proof of legitimacy and cooperation. Others, afraid of non-compliance penalties or further fines, followed suit. Her manipulation extended to official-sounding phone calls. Using a prepaid number with a professional voicemail greeting, she made follow-up calls to those who hadn't responded to her letters. She left messages with phrases like, "We're conducting an HOA audit," or "This is a courtesy call from the Homeowners Association office." Most people didn't bother to call back. Just hearing those words was enough to convince them to comply. Karen didn't need brute force to control the narrative. She relied on presentation, language, and persistence. She understood that if something looked official, sounded official, and was delivered consistently, it would be treated as official. Her calculated use of communication allowed her to shape reality within the neighborhood, manipulating trust and routine until resistance seemed not only difficult but unnecessary. At first, everything seemed orderly. Karen's communication was consistent, her presence visible, and her directives clear. Residents believed she was simply a strict, by-the-book HOA president trying to whip the community into better shape. But over time, cracks began to show. It started with small inconsistencies, details that didn't quite line up with what residents remembered or expected. One neighbor, Jim, noticed that the email Karen sent him about a fine was oddly formatted, different from previous official notices. The font was slightly off, and the header, while similar, lacked the watermark the HOA usually included. He shrugged it off at first, but it stayed in his mind. Then came the questions about voting. Susan, who had lived in the neighborhood for 10 years, realized that she hadn't received any ballot or notice about an HOA election. She mentioned it casually during a conversation with a neighbor who admitted they hadn't received anything either. Soon, more people began recalling that no official announcement about a change in leadership had ever been made. Karen had simply appeared as president one day, and no one could pinpoint when or how it happened. It wasn't just longtime residents raising concerns. Newer homeowners who were less familiar with the HOA's standard procedures also began to question the unusual level of enforcement. One family received 2 warnings in a week, one for leaving a recycling bin visible on non-pickup days and another for having a seasonal flag that allegedly violated aesthetic consistency. They found it odd but assumed they had missed something in the bylaws. When they asked Karen for clarification, her answers were vague. She cited policy numbers without providing the actual documents, deflecting the conversation with phrases like, "It's all in the homeowner packet," or "We're just following updated standards." Meanwhile, the tone of her communication began to shift. Her once friendly updates took on a colder, more bureaucratic style. Instead of engaging in open dialogue, she began disabling comments on Facebook posts and directing questions to her private inbox. Residents who pushed back found their comments deleted or ignored. Karen framed it as an effort to reduce misinformation, but many saw it as censorship. A few neighbors began whispering to each other, who exactly gave her this authority? Tension increased when Karen attempted to enforce new regulations without any input from the community. She claimed that new landscaping requirements were being rolled out to improve property values, but when a group of residents asked to see the meeting minutes where these changes were discussed, she couldn't provide them. She said the changes had been approved in a closed board session, but no one knew who was on that board. Several residents had served on HOA committees in the past and had never heard of such a session taking place. One neighbor, Marcus, decided to do some digging. He reached out to the county office to request the most recent filing for the HOA board, expecting to see Karen's name listed as president. What he found instead was that the official president on record was still Denise, the woman who had gone quiet a few months earlier. Confused, Marcus brought this information to a few other neighbors who were shocked. If Denise was still the registered president, how was Karen acting in her place with such authority? Rumors started circulating. Some believed there had been a quiet internal transition. Others suspected Karen had taken control without permission. A few were too busy or uninterested to care, but a growing number of residents were no longer convinced that everything was above board. Karen's repeated insistence on confidentiality and her unwillingness to provide documentation only added to the unease. The situation escalated when a resident was threatened with legal action for non-payment of a mandatory improvement fee Karen had introduced. The resident contacted a lawyer who reviewed the HOA's governing documents and confirmed that no such fee had ever been approved. That triggered alarm bells. If Karen was fabricating fees, what else had she created out of thin air? As more residents began to talk to each other, patterns emerged. The fines, the rules, the changes in policy, they had all come from one source. The lack of transparency, the absence of official board meetings, the vague references to non-existent votes, everything pointed to something being deeply wrong. What had initially seemed like assertive leadership now looked more like calculated deception. People began to realize they hadn't just overlooked an election. They may have been duped into following orders from someone who had no legitimate authority at all. Denise had been away for just over 3 months. Her absence, due to a family emergency involving her father's sudden illness, had been unannounced to the general community. As the elected HOA president, she had informed only a small group of board members about her temporary leave, trusting that things would remain stable during her time away. She had no idea that during those few months, someone else would step into her role, not by appointment, but by audacity. When Denise returned, she expected a routine catch-up, a backlog of emails, a few landscaping issues to review, maybe a reminder about the upcoming quarterly meeting. Instead, she walked into a neighborhood that looked the same on the surface but felt strangely tense. Within a few days, she began receiving odd glances from residents, some of whom hesitated before approaching her. A neighbor she had known for years mentioned how strict the new HOA leadership had become and asked if she had met the new president. That was the first red flag. She brushed it off at first, assuming there had been a misunderstanding. But as more neighbors referred to policy changes and new fines, none of which she had authorized, her confusion turned to concern. She reached out to the board members she had trusted to maintain communication during her absence, and their responses shocked her. None of them had approved any leadership change. None had been consulted about the new rules. Most had been just as confused as the residents but hadn't known how to respond. Denise immediately began reviewing HOA records and digital accounts. The official HOA email had been dormant since she left. There were no new entries in the HOA's shared drive, no minutes from any recent meetings, no updated financial logs reflecting the new fines being issued. Yet residents had been receiving emails, printed notices, and even fee requests. That's when she realized someone had created a parallel system, unofficial but convincing. She searched the neighborhood's Facebook group only to discover that she was no longer an admin. She had been quietly removed. In her place, Karen's name appeared at the top alongside titles like Community Director and Acting HOA President. Her posts were frequent, controlling the narrative with updates on policy enforcement, scheduled inspections, and warnings about noncompliance. The group had become less of a community forum and more of a bulletin board for Karen's directives. Denise tried to reintroduce herself in the comments, only to find her posts deleted within hours. When she messaged Karen directly, she received no reply. Realizing this was no longer a simple misunderstanding, Denise contacted the HOA's legal advisor. With documentation in hand, official filings proving her continued presidency, she began building a formal case to reassert her authority. Word spread quickly once Denise started contacting residents directly. She sent emails from the official HOA address, reactivated the HOA newsletter, and began knocking on doors. Many residents were shocked to learn she had never stepped down. Some were embarrassed, realizing they had accepted Karen's leadership without question. Others were skeptical, confused by the conflicting information. But the proof was undeniable. Denise had the original bylaws, the voting records, the county filings. Karen had none of that, only confidence and control over perception. What unsettled Denise most was how deep Karen's deception had gone. Residents had paid fines to a personal account. Rules had been changed without any recorded votes. Subcommittees had been formed without board oversight. Some residents had even performed hours of volunteer work under Karen's direction, believing it was part of a new HOA initiative. It wasn't just a power grab, it was a complete fabrication layered so carefully that it had almost passed for truth. Denise coordinated with the HOA's attorney to begin a formal reinstatement process. Cease and desist letters were drafted. Karen was informed that she had no legal authority to speak or act on behalf of the HOA. But Karen didn't respond, at least not immediately. Instead, she doubled down on her narrative, posting defensive messages in the Facebook group and claiming she had been unofficially appointed by consensus. When asked for proof, she provided none, instead accusing Denise of neglect and mismanagement during her absence. Residents were forced to take sides. Some still supported Karen, citing her responsiveness and visibility. Others rallied behind Denise, recognizing that legitimacy couldn't be faked by presence alone. A neighborhood that once prided itself on harmony had become divided. Denise knew it would take more than documents and emails to fix the damage. She would need to show up, speak directly, and reclaim the trust that had been quietly stolen in her absence. It all came to a head at the monthly HOA community meeting, the first one Denise had scheduled since her return. Flyers had gone out 2 weeks in advance, delivered to every doorstep with a bold reminder: this was the official HOA meeting, open to all residents. The clubhouse, usually half full at best, was packed that evening. Folding chairs had to be brought in from the back. People who hadn't attended a single HOA meeting in years showed up, eager to find out what was going on. The air buzzed with tension and anticipation. Conversations were hushed but urgent. Everyone knew something wasn't right, they just didn't know how it would unfold. Karen showed up too. She arrived early wearing a smart blazer and carrying a thick binder, projecting authority as she had for the past few months. A few residents greeted her with familiarity, others with uncertainty. She took a seat at the front, confidently positioning herself where the HOA board usually sat. But this time she wasn't alone. Denise walked in moments later with a small stack of official documents in hand and an envelope marked with the HOA attorney's letterhead. The room fell quiet when she took her place at the head table. Denise opened the meeting calmly, thanking everyone for attending and noting how important community participation was. Then, without preamble, she addressed the elephant in the room. She explained her temporary absence, why she had not made a public announcement, and the personal reasons that kept her away. She took responsibility for the communication gap and then moved directly to the matter of unauthorized leadership. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming she had stepped up to fill a void. But Denise held her ground. She presented county records, board filings, and a timeline that clearly showed she had never relinquished her role. She read aloud a letter from the HOA's legal counsel stating that no leadership change had ever been discussed, let alone approved. She showed printouts of official emails and referenced financial records that contrasted with the unofficial fines and fees Karen had imposed. The crowd sat in stunned silence as Denise went through each of Karen's so-called initiatives, fines, inspections, new rules, committee appointments, and explained how none of them had been approved through the proper process. She handed out copies of the bylaws to attendees and highlighted the clauses that required board votes, written approvals, and transparent communication. People began whispering, flipping through pages, checking what they had overlooked. Karen pushed back, trying to rally support by pointing to the work she had done, insisting she had acted with good intentions. But her voice was less certain now. She struggled to offer any hard evidence. When a resident asked for minutes from the meetings she claimed to have held, she admitted there were none. When another asked who had appointed her, she vaguely mentioned community support but couldn't name names or provide signatures. The questions grew sharper. One by one, residents who had paid fines began speaking up. They asked where their money had gone, who had authorized the transactions, and why no receipts had been issued. Others brought up the confusion they felt, the emails they had received from unfamiliar addresses, and how afraid they were to challenge the rules Karen had enforced. A few even admitted they'd been skeptical from the start but hadn't known who to turn to for answers. What had started as a tense meeting shifted into something closer to a courtroom. Karen's confidence waned as the evidence mounted. Denise remained composed, backed by documents, a clear chain of communication, and the undeniable weight of legal legitimacy. The room turned. Residents who had supported Karen began to grow quiet. Others openly voiced frustration and concern. What had felt like a grassroots leadership effort was now being seen in a different light, less like service, more like a con. One resident stood up and asked directly if Karen had collected money without HOA authorization. She didn't answer. Another asked how she had gained control of the Facebook group. She deflected, saying it was for moderation purposes. Denise informed the group that she had already contacted the platform's support team and was in the process of reclaiming the official communication channel. People nodded. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Karen made one final attempt to defend herself, saying she only did what she thought was necessary. But by then, the damage was done. Her binder of notes, her confident tone, even her well-practiced explanations no longer carried weight. She was no longer seen as a leader, but as someone who had taken advantage of a situation, manipulated trust, and blurred the line between authority and illusion. In the days following the meeting, the neighborhood felt like it was slowly exhaling. Conversations that had once been hushed were now out in the open. People no longer spoke in vague terms about changes or new rules. They talked plainly about what had happened, how they'd been misled, and how easy it had been to believe something simply because it looked official. The realization that a single person could manipulate an entire community through confidence and presentation left many residents both embarrassed and angry. Some blamed themselves for not asking more questions. Others wondered how many times they had blindly followed rules without ever checking where those rules had come from. Denise got to work right away, not with punishment but with repair. She scheduled another meeting, this one strictly to listen. Residents were invited to voice concerns, ask questions, and share their experiences under Karen's brief, unauthorized tenure. People lined up to speak. One man said he had paid over $150 in cumulative violations for things like an oil spot in his driveway and leaving a garbage bin out 15 minutes past pickup. Another woman explained that she'd repainted her front door to comply with what she believed were new HOA color standards Karen had printed out on a laminated sheet and pinned to the clubhouse board. Several residents had similar stories of complying with rules that didn't exist, paying fees that went unrecorded, and making changes they hadn't wanted to make, all because they were afraid of receiving more notices or, worse, escalating consequences. What surprised everyone most wasn't just Karen's nerve, it was how easily the deception had taken root. She hadn't needed force or threats. She didn't have passwords to the HOA's internal systems, access to financial accounts, or the authority to sign anything. Yet for months she had operated as if she did. All it took was polished emails, printed notices, and the kind of tone people associate with authority. The facade had been enough. Once the illusion was broken, the simplicity of it became unsettling. In the background, Denise and the HOA attorney were quietly gathering everything they needed to pursue legal recourse. Karen had received a formal cease and desist, and the board was preparing to submit a claim to recover funds collected under false pretenses. But that process, however necessary, was slow. What moved more quickly was the community's effort to rebuild its sense of order and trust. Denise reinstated official HOA communication channels, made financial reports more accessible, and added an open comments section to the HOA's monthly newsletter. The Facebook group was returned to its original administrative structure, with new guidelines posted to prevent similar misuse in the future. Residents who had previously remained on the sidelines now began showing up to meetings. Interest in serving on committees surged. People who had never spoken during HOA events were volunteering for landscaping groups, newsletter edits, and rule revision subcommittees. The deception had shaken them, but it had also activated them. The apathy that Karen had relied on to operate unchecked was being replaced by something stronger: engagement. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost. She stopped attending meetings, ceased posting in the Facebook group, and no longer responded to emails. Some residents saw her walking her dog at odd hours, avoiding eye contact. A few speculated about whether she felt remorse or embarrassment. Others didn't care. They were more focused on understanding how they'd been duped and how to prevent it from happening again. Denise made a point of not turning the ordeal into a spectacle. There were no public shaming sessions, no grand statements of victory. Instead, she framed it as a community learning experience, one that exposed weaknesses but also revealed resilience. She encouraged residents to look at documents, attend meetings, and verify information before acting on it. She even held a workshop explaining the structure of the HOA, how decisions were made, and what processes were required to approve changes. For many, it was the first time they truly understood how their neighborhood was governed. Out of the chaos, a new culture began to emerge. Trust had been broken, but it was being rebuilt. Slowly, carefully, and with transparency. The experience left a mark on the community, not as a scandal that tore people apart, but as a wake-up call that brought them closer to the systems they had long taken for granted. They no longer assumed that authority came with a title or a clipboard. They asked questions. They read the fine print. And above all, they remembered that leadership wasn't just about visibility or confidence, it was about legitimacy, accountability, and trust that had to be earned, not declared.